Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we look into the new Gaza plan. Let's get started. I feel kind of bad that I've had this plan for this podcast episode for pretty much a week. And I know that I wish I could be putting out stuff more frequently to keep up with the news cycle. And sadly, the news cycle goes so quickly these days that it's kind of hard to do in a weekly podcast. So I do apologize that maybe these things aren't as current, or I'm not talking about everything that's happened. I do want to acknowledge the unfortunate situation from this past weekend, the 3 hostages that were released from Gaza that most of you probably have seen by now look absolutely terrible. And honestly, it looks kind of like pictures out of the Holocaust. With that said, unfortunately, we don't really have as much time to talk about that today, but it is somewhat connected that I've been asked by many of our followers, people in my personal life, for my opinion on the quote-unquote Trump Gaza plan. It's been in the news pretty much since last week. It's kind of changed in many ways over the week, but I do want to talk about it with my listeners because despite the fact that many of you know I don't get into politics, it actually is a somewhat good plan. And many people misunderstand it for many reasons, and we'll get into that. But it is worth talking about because it does something that nobody has done before to maybe stop this reoccurring cycle in Gaza from happening. So for this episode, I'm really hoping that we'll get to talk a little bit about the Gaza situation in the sense of what's happened in the past, what this new proposal might actually look like, and how it solves some of the issues that we've been dealing with for over 20 years. But I want to start a little bit off topic, so forgive me. There was an amazing quote that one of our followers sent us. It was from an IDF soldier. He was giving a presentation to a group of people about his experience in Gaza. And he said something that is not only very poetic, but brilliant. Absolutely brilliant, and it will start us off on the right foot for this podcast. This IDF member pointed out the similarities between the, quote, road to Auschwitz, or the train tracks to Auschwitz, and what's going on today. In 1940s, they literally built train tracks that went into Auschwitz right to the gas chambers. And today, we don't really have the train tracks to the gas chambers anymore. But we are seeing with the UN, with the entire world, with the media, with these supposed humanitarian rights groups, they are, in his words, metaphorically creating the road or the train track to Auschwitz. They are building the infrastructure for us to be killed. And he specifically is talking about the United Nations and all of these organizations that were intended after World War II to stop this from happening ever again. And yet it's those exact bodies that are now, quote, paving the way to Auschwitz. It is really sickening to see. And that's where I can see this tying into today's episode, which is the fact that the road to Auschwitz, or the road to the Jewish destruction in Israel and around the world, frankly, is being prepared and set up by the United Nations and by all of these organizations. And instead of Auschwitz, it's in our own land. It's these Islamic extremist groups, including Iran, who control the UN, who are paving the way to our destruction. Even though the two-state solution that we used to always talk about was a legitimate idea at one point, after so many years of attempting two-state solutions, as you've heard on this podcast, go back to many of my old episodes where we talked about all the failed attempts at a two-state solution. This two-state solution seems to be the new attempt to create an Auschwitz-like situation. They want to put a group of people who are sworn openly to our death on our border. And because they're the UN and aid groups and humanitarian groups, for some reason we are like, I guess they have a point. A two-state solution only works when you actually have two states that are willing to be peaceful side by side. And the Palestinian Arabs of today, unlike in the past who were also not great, but maybe a little bit more moderate, the Palestinian Arabs of today are absolutely not interested in two states. As I've said on this podcast before, They say from the river to the sea. They don't say from the river to wherever the deal happens to land. A two-state solution at this point, being pushed by the UN and all these other organizations, seems to be just the stepping stone to destruction of Israel and murder of all the Jews in that land. Or maybe if we're lucky, we'll just be subjugated and made into dhimmis like in the past. We would have to pay the humiliation tax to the Arabs for not being Muslim. We already see right now, without a state, without an army, official army anyway, that these people are aimed at our destruction. But we think that if we give them a state and an army and a bunch of weapons and a ton of money, that somehow their desire to kill us is going to stop. We haven't seen it yet. That was literally the point of the Oslo Accord, of having these 3 zones, different stages, where we can see to trust them, okay, we're working together, we can move to stage 2 and give you more autonomy and more land. And we're stuck in stage 1 because they have never proven to actually be a partner for peace. So when we talk about Gaza, what is the point in having a 2-state solution anymore? It seems like, I hate to say, it's kind of a dead idea. And this is where I get into the new Trump proposal plan. I've said on this podcast many times, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results, which couldn't be more true when it comes to Gaza. How many times have they started a conflict? Israel's been forced into a ceasefire. We've been flooding them with money to rebuild. And then we have another conflict right after. So what it seems like the new plan is to break that cycle. And it's not the worst plan in the world. Let me caveat this entire thing by saying, aside from the obvious, that Trump made this plan up seemingly out of his own head, that it doesn't seem like he had much thought. And I hate to say, it's kind of changed from time to time. First, he was going to kick some people out. Then he was going to kick everybody out. Then it was temporary. Then it's permanent. So I'm going to base it on sort of the first initial plan and kind of ignore the later additions and subtractions he had made, just so we could talk about the concept in general, some of the ideas that he had proposed that may or may not work. So from the start, when we talk about his plan seemed to be somewhat reasonable. Obviously, we know that the area of Gaza has been destroyed thanks to the IDF getting rid of many of Hamas's tunnels. The whole area has been pretty much uninhabitable. So the initial plan was, instead of doing what we've done in the past every single time, which is flood money into the area, which always goes to Hamas because they are in charge. And unfortunately, at this time, we see that Hamas technically is still in charge. They've killed anybody who has tried to go against them. Who do you send the money to rebuild without causing the exact same problem we did last time? So the initial phase of this plan that Trump had was to simply take that same money that they were offering to the people of Gaza, and rather than give it to Hamas, which is what everyone's done in the past, take that money, offer it to Egypt and to Jordan, and say to them, we will help fund areas, neighborhoods that you can build in order to house Palestinian Arabs from Gaza. And one of the great side effects of this plan would be that if we give money to places like Egypt and Jordan to build, they can start building today. They can start mass construction on all kinds of homes and places for people to live now. Whereas if we send that money to Hamas, or anybody for that matter in Gaza, it's going to take many, many, many years just to clean the site enough that we can start building. How are we going to build on top of rubble? So the initial phase of this plan was pretty smart. Start building in a nice, safe area right now. Start moving people into those areas immediately, as quickly as you can. And you get rid of the issue of how long it will take to rebuild Gaza. And also get rid of the issue of Hamas getting that money in order to rebuild its terror infrastructure, which is 100% their plan. So the next aspect of this question on what to do next would be the permanence of this situation. And again, not that I'm running cover for Donald Trump, because I have no intention of doing that. But what he tried to do at first anyway is to suggest that this is merely temporary. So it actually isn't a bad idea, where what you'll do is you'll set up these homes. They can be moved into relatively quickly. The people will get to move there and be happy and safe and away from future war and conflict, and especially Hamas. And maybe in 10, 15 years or whatever it might be, by the time they've completely wiped out Hamas and the Gaza area has been rebuilt in some fashion, in some manner, that those people who are now in, let's say, Egypt or Jordan can decide, do I want to move back to Gaza? Now it's been wiped clean of Hamas, and now that the homes are rebuilt, can I move back there? Or am I settled here? My kids are in a school, my kids are happy, whatever it might be. It actually isn't a terrible idea. Then eventually Trump did come out, and I think he suggested it was permanent, which is a whole other story, because that of course changes things slightly. But again, I can't go chasing after every thought that he has. But as a concept, the idea of removing the people from Gaza, even temporarily, and giving them an opportunity to leave, to get away from the war and the conflict and the cycle, and give them a safe place to live, isn't a terrible idea. And let's not forget that taking those people out of Gaza, the human shields, will severely change the battlefield. Hamas purposely uses human shields. That is part of their strategy. And if you take those people out and move them somewhere safe where they are not going to be harmed, but also Hamas cannot use them as human shields, I don't really know how Hamas is going to be able to fight when they don't have human shields. That's been their idea since the beginning. So I really don't see a lot of downsides, if I can be honest, with this idea. If we talk maybe temporarily, whatever it might be, this is a good idea to not only help the people of Gaza, but also to harm Hamas, not give them any money, not let them use human shields. Now, we have to obviously mention the other side of this argument, because of course, the minute that this came out in the news, we had pro-Pallies saying that this is the worst thing that's ever been proposed. Of course, they called it an ethnic cleansing. How dare you move populations to safer places? This cannot happen. What you will very quickly find out in this little area of the episode is how little the international world actually cares about Gazans. You will see very quickly that they are the problem facilitating death and destruction and terrible lives for the Gazan people. It is the world keeping them in a prison because they go against this idea. And I'll explain why. It is pretty simple to think about. If you think about Syria, when they had a civil war, things were really bad, things were dangerous, people were dying, innocent civilians, of course, being killed all over the place, 500,000 people killed. The world opened up its doors. The world said, absolutely, Syrians, you're welcome here. Please come as refugees. Everybody took them. Nobody batted an eye. Nearly 7 million people left Syria for the Western world. Some temporarily, some permanently. If we think about Ukraine and Russia, when Russia invaded, tens of thousands of Ukrainians fled to Europe, fled to America. The world opened their arms. Please come to us where it's safe. Can you see where I'm going here? Because now Gaza is a nightmare. Gaza is at a war caused by Hamas. Gaza is apparently in a famine and completely destroyed and uninhabitable. The famine is fake, but everything else is real. And yet the world is absolutely not saying, come to us. Please, we will give you a place to stay. What are they saying? The United Nations, every organization, every country leader is saying, no, 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 you stay there. We don't want an ethnic cleansing to happen. If we move 1.8 million people out of that region for their own safety, that'll be an ethnic cleansing. 60 million Syrians fleeing, temporarily or not an ethnic cleansing. But if even one person leaves Gaza, how dare you leave your homeland? That is terrible. You should stay there, and you should fight for your fake country, and you should die for it too, says the world. Every other country around the world, refugees leave all the time. But apparently in Gaza, you need to stay there and you need to fight for your rights and survive in that area. This is how the world is keeping them in a prison. And ironically, Donald Trump actually got this one right by suggesting, why are we keeping them in a prison? If you're saying that place is terrible, why don't we let them go somewhere else, even temporarily? So it actually is pretty funny when people make fun of the Trump plan, Because the Trump plan is kind of the plan we use in every other country around the world, which is when there's a war, we let people leave as refugees. Some come back, some don't. But for some reason, when it's the Palestinian Arabs in Gaza, nope, you stay there, you don't get to go anywhere. And since we're already talking about how the world hates ethnic cleansings, it is ironic that apparently the world kind of is okay with certain ethnic cleansings, because there have been multiple times within Israel's history where people have been ethnically cleansed. And not only is the world okay with it, the world is currently asking for ethnic cleansings right now, as long as it's against the Jews. Obviously, we can probably leave aside the 850,000 Mizrahi Jews that were kicked out of the Middle East when the state of Israel was born. A literal ethnic cleansing to the point where there are maybe a couple thousand Jews in the entire Middle East other than Israel. There are actual laws on the books when Jordan was created that part of the deal that created Jordan with the colonizing British was that no Jews were allowed to live there. That would be an ethnic cleansing, not to mention an apartheid. The British also played a role in clearing out places like Gaza and of the Sinai Peninsula of Jews. And following the 1967 war, when Israel regained areas in a defensive war, like Sinai and Gaza and Judea and Samaria or the West Bank, Jews wanted to go back home. The Jews that had been kicked out, their families that had been killed or kicked out of these areas, they went back. And in the case of Egypt, when they made a peace deal, the people who had lived in that area for quite some time following the 1967 war were literally forcibly ethnically cleansed from the Sinai Peninsula. As part of the deal with Egypt, they removed all Jewish people from that area. Of course, they didn't want Gaza back, so Jews were still in Gaza because the Jews had always lived in Gaza. But no one seemed to care when Egypt demanded an ethnic cleansing of the Jews. I guess maybe because it was at the hands of the Israelis that they pulled out their people. So the world was fine with it. And sadly, this continued because in 2005, when the Israelis pulled out in hopes for peace with the Palestinian Arabs, they also had to pull their people out. Again, people who had lived there for 40, 50 years in the Gaza region were pulled out in hopes for peace. A literal ethnic cleansing. And the world clapped and applauded. I guess because they believed, oh, well, this is Palestinian land. Therefore, it's great that we're ethnically cleansing Jews. So apparently ethnic cleansing is okay as long as it's for peace. But not if it means that the Gazans have to move anywhere. Only the Jews should have to move and be ethnically cleansed for peace. And this is saying nothing about Judea and Samaria or West Bank, where the world is more than happy to have an ethnic cleansing there to make sure there are no Jews left in any future peace deal. So we can see that the outrage over the supposed ethnic cleansing is a little ridiculous. The people in Gaza right now actually have supported this idea, some of them. I received a question from one of my friends about explaining how she's seeing videos of people supporting Trump's plan and also people not supporting Trump's plan, and I explained this to her. Obviously, when Hamas is in charge in Gaza, if you are on Team Hamas, you're obviously going to be saying, great, Hamas should stay, screw that, we're not leaving, we want to be with Hamas, we're going to support them to the end. The people who are not with Hamas, the people who maybe aren't willing to say they're not with Hamas, the people who hate Hamas and are attacked and killed and jailed by Hamas, they probably want to leave. And many of them have said, Trump's plan is amazing because it gives me the chance to get out of this prison that Hamas has created and the world is keeping me in. And it's not a very stupid idea because people are already leaving to Egypt right now. The difference is, because right now Egypt has a closed border, most of these people in Gaza who do want to leave have to pay up to $10,000 in bribes in order to get into Egypt and then leave. So what Trump is suggesting is that instead of making them pay $10,000 that most people in Gaza can't afford, just let them go. If someone wants to leave, let them leave. But the world really doesn't want that. As I said before, they are aiming to keep these people in a prison a prison that can be used in order to demonize Israel. They love the fact that Israel is demonized every 5 or 6 years. Every time Hamas attacks, they put out their PR, and Israel is demonized, and Israel gets weaker on the world stage. This is part of their plan. This has nothing to do with the people of Gaza. The people of Gaza, admittedly, are living in a poor situation. The only way to change this cycle is to remove them as human shields, is to remove them from the constant cycle of war, and is to eventually maybe let them go back to Gaza that has been completely de-radicalized. In the end, I don't really think that this plan is really going to happen for a variety of reasons. I don't know if Trump actually means it, if he's going to actually put it into place, how physically and logistically this could even happen. As long as Egypt and Jordan are willing to keep the Gazans in a prison, you can't really force them to take them. So this whole thing might be a little bit of a thought experiment, but it really has at least started a conversation that we cannot go back to the way things used to be. The funding of Hamas to rebuild, they rebuild terror tunnels, and then we repeat the entire war all over again in a few years. Something has to change. And maybe Trump has stumbled on something here by accident, unintentionally. And I've said this on the podcast many, many times. As long as the Palestinian Arabs, the Hamas people, and the PA have been told that no matter what you do, we will always grant you 1967 borders. You can try and kill Israel. You can turn down as many peace deals as you want. No matter what happens, 1967 is yours. And if you get more land in some type of other deal, or if you get more land through terrorism, that's great. Good for you. But you'll always have a fallback to 1967. And maybe what Trump is doing here, even just through a fear tactic, is telling the Palestinian Arabs, you better make a deal because you might actually lose 1967. You might get kicked out and lose Gaza. I think it really is game-changing when you think about it, to no longer allow them to just sit and wait and try to kill Israel through PR or through weapons, and always be guaranteed some type of deal with whatever they want. There needs to be consequences to them not actually making a deal. And maybe, even just as a fear tactic, this could change what's going on at the bargaining table. Maybe the people, and even the more moderate Palestinian Authority, which by the way is still a terrorist organization and supports terror, maybe when they realize that their 1967 borders is not quite as solidified as it used to be, and that they could technically annex the area or throw out the Oslo Accord, maybe that changes the calculus a little bit when they're negotiating with Israel next time. Maybe the next peace deal, they're going to say, well, we better actually consider taking this one because we don't know if 1967 borders is going to be on the table anymore. So do I personally think that this is going to happen? I don't know. But I'll be honest, it's really hard not to think that if you care about the Palestinian Arabs in Gaza, that you wouldn't support the idea of letting these people move to wherever they're supposed to go to get away from the terrible conditions they're being kept in. We cannot sit back and allow the world and the United Nations and all of these aid organizations who claim to care about Palestinian Arabs keep them in a prison, not making their lives better, and keeping them under the occupation of their own government. And maybe this new Gaza plan is the thing that'll actually finally do it. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.